Chess, its history and its theory. First, the history. The first ever known origins of chess date back to the 7th century in Persia, when a great ruler of India had introduced it to the people of Persia. The first actual written account of chess dated back to 840. The first manual was written in Arabic and written by a renowned Arabic chess player at the time. A more modern type of chess was normalized in Spain around 1200, when a famous book about chess, backgammon, and dice was published. Normalized rules in other parts of Europe and Asia started to become amended to the series of Spain's rule set, making the rules almost parallel to modern chess. Chess theory writings had started to arise around the late 15th century, where some of the first were around 1490. They were about some openings and a few 30-second endings, and those books were deposited in the library for the University of Göttingen. From 1700 to 1873, there was some kind of romanticism that Europe had with chess as its popularity moved from southern Europe to mainland France. People played this game like crazy, and it got really popular in France. And the game itself got a lot more tactical when the philosophy of the game was expanded upon so heavily. Chess theory got more and more popular, more openings and endgames, and along with incorporating the newer idea of middle games and how to use those. The game was becoming a lot more widened to Europe too. In the later 18th century, the idea of Western chess, aka international chess, was more or less created when stalemates, castling, and en passant were standardized into chess rules. Around the same time, one of the first chess tournaments was held, where the American Paul Morphy had won against all opponents, except for one of them. He had refused to play against Morphy. Wilhelm Steinitz was the first person to strategically map out his moves well enough to beat the first chess master, Johannes Zukertort. The 19th century was when annual tournaments were held more often, and in 1924, the FIDE, aka the International Chess Federation, was officially created. In 1950, the FIDE started using titles and officially declared 27 individual grandmasters and international masters. Chess technology, or computerized chess, came around the 70s, but was more normalized and made much better after the 90s. During the 70s, it was sold as a home entertainment application for personal computers, and after the 90s, many people were able to play with others over the internet. During the 2020 COVID pandemic, online chess grew to an extreme amount due to everyone being inside and more people showing interest in the sport. Now, the theory behind chess. Chess is usually divided into 3 phases. These phases are combined to create good and well thought out games. These different theories use tactics that can be used to hold your ground against the other player and have a very good offensive against them. There are many different types of openings and countless numbers of mid-games and endgames. Here are the different ones. Opening theory is recognized as the moves at the beginning of the game that decide the later moves of the match. They usually have names associated with them for how notable they are. For example, the Ruy Lopez and the Sicilian defense. Openings usually take around 10 to 20 moves, or 30 at the most. This isn't a pinpoint number, this is just an approximation. Currently, there are about over 1,300 different openings, with more openings being found every so often, as the sport still evolves. There are 4 main things to keep in mind when using openings. Development. The placement of pieces is key to a solid opening, and are focused on bishops and knights being placed in very useful squares. This will have a heavy influence in the rest of the game. Central control is the control of the squares in the middle of the board, and are important to having many movement options open. This will give you the ability to cramp the enemy into a corner for the later game. King defense. Keeping the king safe is extra important for sudden attacks that can easily lead to quick checks, or even end in a swift checkmate. Castling is a good option for safety. Pawn structure. Avoiding weaknesses in how pawns are laid out, such as pawns that are in line, pawns that are isolated, pawns that cannot move without being taken, or having a higher amount of pawn islands than the enemy. Players should rather push the other players into these weaknesses. Openings can vary from being offensive and attacking head-on from the start, or being positional and having a very well thought out defense. For example, a good offensive opening is the Latvian Gambit. A good example of a strategic opening is the ready opening. Flaws that can come with being aggressive in an opening are that a player may not have a stable ground to play on in the later game. Flaws for playing defensively are that the openings may fail to be done properly and can result in pieces being unnecessarily sacrificed, or that you may not have the opportunity to take enough of the enemy's pieces and put yourself ahead of them. Even with these flaws, in many of the right cases, the positives can outweigh the negatives. Opening theory mainly looks to figure out the best way to start a game with many different options available, and how to create a good middle game that favors your material more than the opponent's and opens up the enemy king to a future check. Middle game theory is the phase that comes obviously right after the opening, and has no clear division between the opening and middle game depending on where it starts. Middle game is only really determined when there is a good enough development of the pieces. When this point of the game is recognized, players have to make decisions depending on where their pieces are currently placed and play depending on this development. This is where most combinations occur. Middle game combinations are where you play a set of thought out and tactical moves that leads to some kind of gain, typically in the amount of pieces you have over the opponent. This is usually the section of the game where you take or lose a significant amount of pieces. An example of a middle game combo is the Lasker-Bauer combo. This was a game that went down in 1889 where Lasker plays the white pieces and Bauer plays the black pieces. Lasker has the advantage of his entry into the middle game with his bishop placement, allowing his bishops to be sacrificed to take both pawns that cover Bauer's king, leaving it exposed to later moves of Lasker's queen and kingside rook. This caused Bauer to try his hardest to protect his king, in turn leading him to expend his queen, other higher pieces, and his fortification of pawns. A very important strategic question is simply how to simplify a middle game, which is how to reduce the overall material on the board entirely enough to transition into an endgame. The thing about this is that it's very situational. It is usually favored for either player to at least have minor material advantages, and with that can have a good chance of a good endgame, but it is definitely still left up to the situation. Middle game theory mainly focuses on chess tactics and chess strategy, and can be practiced heavily using chess composition. Endgame theory is much more to the point and has less strategy and is more about setups for checkmates or even stalemates. Like openings to middle games, there is no defined point where middle games end and endgames begin, but endgames are more or less determined from which kinds of pieces are left on the board. Kings and pawns become much more powerful and important, as pawns are the most common to be left at the end as they try to reach the other end of the board and gain promotion and gain an advantage, and kings can serve the purpose of defending their own pawns and attacking against enemy pawns. Kings will need to be safe from attack in the middle game to really make it well in the endgame, and its movement towards the center of the board is crucial for it to be able to survive and moving freely and dodging enemy attacks. The most common types of checkmates are when one side has a king and the other side has one or two pieces that can checkmate the king, as those pieces have to work together with their own king. More difficult endings are known depending on what pieces are left on the board. For example, rook and pawn versus rook. A certain endgame strategy that is super effective is called Zugzwang. That is a disgusting name. This involves forcing an enemy piece into a position that creates a disadvantage for them that they cannot avoid. Say, for example, take this situation. It is the opponent's turn to move their king, and they can only move it to the space directly left of their pawn to ensure best future safety, meaning it is inevitable for the pawn to avoid getting a disadvantage when the friendly king moves next to their pawn, and then the pawn is able to promote. This is a prime example of Zugzwang. The main point of endgames is the positioning of what few pieces you and your opponent have left in order to complete a game in some kind of manner. This has been Chess, the history and the theory. Like and subscribe. Kings and pawns become much more powerful and I just still need a breath. King defense is keeping the king safe. Nope. I said it wrong again. King defense. Keeping the king is extra God! For example, the Roy Lopez and the... Damn, I said that weird. Okay. Here's the long part. Here comes the... Okay, no, I'm not going to say that. In 1950, the FIDE started using titles and officially Whoa, I sound like a toddler. Wilhelm Steinitz was the first person to strategically map how it was the first person to... Oh, wow, I suck at reading. I need a breath. Chess... Okay.